Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about 5 orchid care rules that we can actually break. Now, these care rules have been set in place due to some very strong reasons. However, in some cases, I just feel they extended more than they should have, and because very few sources actually explain why we shouldn't do certain things, I feel that many times they lead to useless effort. But the only way to know if, when, and how to break these rules is to know why they exist and understand the processes. Bottom line, we should break rules in the smart way. Alrighty, before we get into the subject, I would just like to say thank you guys so much. We just hit 50,000 subscribers. Oh my goodness, this is a seriously big number for me. Thank you all so much. I'm glad you enjoy my videos enough to subscribe. And thank you a bunch for rating, commenting, and sharing my videos. Those are things that really help my channel grow, and I'm very grateful. Alrighty, now let's get to rule number 1. Always water orchids in the morning. Now, most orchid growers do indeed water orchids in the morning, me included. I do enjoy watering orchids while I have my coffee. However, what happens if we don't have time to water in the morning? Maybe we have to go to work, our orchids are very dry, very dehydrated. Should we postpone watering because we cannot water in the morning? Well, the answer is no, you can absolutely water whenever you want. The logic behind this rule is water evaporation. You might already know that it's not a good idea to leave standing water in between the leaves in the crowns of orchids because it can lead to rotting if water doesn't evaporate in time. Well, generally in the daytime, evaporation rate of water is higher due to probable higher temperatures caused by sunlight. Maybe in a home we are more prone to leave the windows open during daytime than we are in nighttime. So whatever little excessive spillage we might have on our orchid from watering has greater chances to evaporate in the daytime, not in the nighttime. And pretty much that is why this rule is in place, and it absolutely works. But now that we know why this rule was created, we can break it a little bit. All we have to do is make sure that we do not leave any standing water in crowns, in between leaves, and in new growths. However, this can be easier said than done. If you're using a watering can or you water at the sink, there is a chance that water will splash on the orchid and enter new growth. Also, if you make a wrong movement at the sink, the faucet might end up right above the crown of an orchid. So if you fear that that will be the case for you and you cannot guarantee that you will water the orchid without actually leaving pools of water on its leaves and crowns, all you need to do is get yourself a separate container, such as a bowl or a decorative pot without drainage holes. Pre-fill it with water, don't go all the way to the brim though, and simply place your orchid pot inside, submerging it slowly, and you will see that the water level inside the decorative container will rise with the addition of the orchid. So now you can let this orchid soak for a few minutes, or if it's not necessary, pull it out after a few seconds, and there we go. We have a watered orchid that has no water pools or droplets on the foliage or new growths. Next thing to do is just let the orchid drain very well on a separate dish or on the side of your sink, get rid of the soaking water, and then place the orchid back in its location. In this way, you can water whenever your orchid needs water. If you don't have time to water in the morning, no problem. You can even water at midnight. Second orchid care rule, which is related to the first one, never leave water standing on the leaves, in the crowns, in between the leaves and new growths. And for the main part, we do follow this rule, particularly if we grow our orchids in the house. However, we can definitely break this rule, and sometimes it is necessary to break it. In time, orchids accumulate dust on their leaves, and while it's easy to remove the dust on the surface, what do we do with the back of the leaves? It's not a good idea to rub it off because we can block the breathing mechanism of an orchid. All orchids have their stomatas placed on the underside of the leaf. And while some orchids like Phalaenopsis don't usually get very dusty under the leaves, orchids with straight leaves such as Cattleyas and Brassivolas definitely can gather a lot of dust on the back of their leaves. And that dust can actually suffocate the leaves. So in the orchid hobby, it's not uncommon for us to shower our orchids, but that would be against this rule. Not leaving water pooling in the crown and in between the leaves is definitely a rule to follow. But if we think about orchids in nature, we know they get rained on periodically. How can they survive this? Well, we need to know there is a major difference between an orchid outside and our orchids inside the house. In their natural habitat, they are exposed to fresh air all the time. Also, air movement contributes to evaporation of water. And also some orchids grow differently in their natural habitat than they do in our homes, such as the Phalaenopsis. Rather than growing upwards, they grow facing downwards. Leaving water standing in these structures can lead to severe rotting. So now that we know why the rule is in place and what can happen if we do not follow it, we know how to break this rule. All we need to do is make sure that the water on our orchid evaporates. And yet again, this is easier said than done. First of all, in order for water to evaporate fast, it needs two important things. One is higher temperature, and the second one is air movement. So it is a lot safer after we shower our orchids to place them outside if it is warm. Outside the house, there's always ventilation, there's a lot of fresh air, so there's not a whole accumulation of microbes and bacteria in the air. And all of these factors will help us stay a lot clearer from infections. Additionally, if we see pools of water in crowns, especially with monopodial orchids or orchids which have rosettes, it's a good idea to get a paper napkin and just suck up all that excessive water. In this way, we make sure there is a lower quantity of water having to evaporate. However, placing orchids outside should only be done in warm weather. Also, never place a wet orchid in the sunlight. It can actually get burned. But what do we do in the winter time? Well, although it's not ideal to dry an orchid in the house, there are ways to make sure that the water evaporates. First of all, we need to refresh the air in our chambers. But if it's cold outside, open the windows before you actually shower your orchids. So after we refresh the air, we need to crank up that heat. We need to make the room very, very warm. And also, we need a fan. This will emulate winds outside and will keep the air moving and water evaporation high. It is also a very good idea to protect new growth because water can go deep inside these layers of leaves. And if it gets trapped inside, no matter what we do, the water will not evaporate. Now, since these are new growths, most probably they're not dusty. So what we can do when we shower the orchid is just make sure the new growth is protected. And the best way to do it is by placing a plastic bag on top of it, and in this way no water will actually touch it. Rule number 3. Sterilize new medium before repotting orchids inside it. Now, this is not such a general rule, but I do know some articles or some sources suggesting that you do sterilize your freshly purchased medium. In this case, not only can we break this rule, but it is actually advisable to break it. The 3 most common ways to sterilize orchid medium is by boiling, placing it in the oven, or microwaving it. But there are cases in which these sterilization processes are really detrimental, and most of them refer to organic medium. Through boiling, bark and coconut husk will start to degrade in the sense that they will change their integrity. Boiled bark will retain more water, and because it is organic, it will decompose faster. Usually with organic medium, the more moist it stays, the faster it decomposes. If we boil it before we use it, we make it a lot more water absorbent, so it will decompose a lot faster. So with any of the organic mediums popularly used with orchids such as bark, coconut husk and sphagnum moss, it is a definite no-no to boiling. Baking it in the oven is not that detrimental, but because of the high heat, there is a degree of degradation as well. The integrity of the materials might deteriorate a little bit through high temperatures as well. So even if it's not like boiling, I do suspect the medium will become more water retentive as well. Microwaving is not always a good solution either. It's a common fact that ants can actually survive microwaving. Maybe it's due to their size. But if ants can survive the microwave, who knows what other very tiny critters can as well. So generally speaking, it's not a great idea to sterilize organic orchid medium unless you really don't have a choice. But there are so many brands producing these types of mediums that in most cases you can find a brand that produces high quality medium. The medium should be prepared already in a certain way and sterilized. However, there is a type of medium that we use in the orchid hobby which can be sterilized both through boiling and also in the oven. And this is inorganic clay medium. Clay substrates such as leca and ceramis are very tough. They will not degrade or change their structure if we boil them or put them through high temperatures. Also, they are not organic, therefore they will not decompose, no matter how much water they retain. In this instance, it is actually very advisable to sterilize this medium if it already has been used with an orchid and we intend to use it with a different orchid. When we purchase this medium, it's not important to sterilize it, but if you feel that the medium you purchased has been exposed to certain things, that you would want to eliminate, then it's perfectly safe to sterilize it through boiling. Speaking about orchid medium, another common rule that you will find in articles is to pre-soak medium before using it with orchids. And while this is a must for certain media, for others it is absolutely unnecessary. And the main medium that doesn't need soaking is bark. Now, the reasoning behind soaking medium is, of course, to soak it with water. In the case of bark, though, usually how we use it with orchids is to let it dry before we rewater the orchid. It is organic, and keeping it too moist will degrade it too fast. If we pre-soak it and then pot an orchid in the bark chips, only to let it dry again, all we're doing is resetting the process. So pretty much all that we will achieve is to make the bark retain a little bit more water for the first time. Afterwards, it will just revert back. So in the case of bark chips, absolutely not necessary to pre-soak it. However, on the market you can find sphagnum moss that is dry and compressed into very thin bricks. That medium should be soaked because there is no way to use it and to expand it unless you soak it. In the same way, coconut husk might come in those compacted bricks, and of course the only way to make it loose is to soak it. Sphagnum moss is easier to work with if it's moist because it's very flexible. Once dry, it becomes more rigid. So with those types of media, yes, it is a good idea to pre-soak them. In the case of inorganic clay medium, it is sometimes a good idea to soak it before use, especially with leca. Ceramis is very water absorbent and it absolutely needs no pre-soaking. It does need rinsing when it's new, but that's a totally different thing. Leca, on the other hand, soaks water very slow. If we intend to use this leca in a setup that should constantly be moist, such as semi-hydroponics, then yes, it is a good idea to allow the leca to soak up water just to maintain the system running and damp all the time. If we use it dry, it might take a while until all of that leca will soak up enough water to maintain the system damp at all times. Ceramis, on the other hand, no matter the usage, never needs to be pre-soaked. And the fifth rule we will discuss about today, and my favorite, is to pre-water orchid pots and orchid roots before fertilizing. The logic behind it is that you are less likely to get root burn if you pre-soak the roots. And with this one, I cannot really say it has any logic behind it, because even though the effect is the same, the reason, in my opinion, is a totally different story. In the orchid hobby, root burn or fertilizer burn is a pretty common occurrence, and of course it is related to the fertilizer. But have you ever wondered, how does fertilizer actually burn the roots? Well, due to involuntary experiments, I learned how. It is not actually when it is dissolved in water, but when it dries and deposits. Due to their hygroscopic nature, fertilizer salts attract moisture. If they happen to deposit on the roots, they will start to withdraw the moisture in the root system. Also, the more concentrated these salts are, the more acidic they usually are as well. If you make a test with your pH meter in a fertilized solution, you will probably see that the pH dropped in comparison to the clean water you used. As long as fertilizer is dissolved in water, it has a lot less chances to actually burn any roots. But once it gets deposited on the roots, then there's where the trouble starts. Now, with pre-watering medium before adding fertilizer, we accomplish one thing: less fertilizer salts in the pot. How is that possible? Well, because we are simply soaking up the medium with clean water, and then when we come with fertilizer water, the medium will not absorb as much fertilized water because it's already soaked with normal water. Therefore, the quantity of salts inside our pot is greatly diminished. If we don't have a lot of salts in our pots, when the water dries, we will not have as many salt deposits or buildups. Pretty logical, right? But you know what? It's also useless effort, because there is an easier way to fix the salt buildup issue. Use less fertilizer. If we pre-soak the medium and then we come with fertilized water that will now remain inside the medium, all we do is pretty much waste fertilizer. If we use a much lower quantity of fertilizer, we save up on fertilizer and also avoid fertilizer buildup. In the orchid hobby, there are a few common ways to fertilize our orchids. One is using half the recommended dosage on the fertilizer label. This is especially useful if you're using tap water with medium hardness. Tap water already has some magnesium and calcium salts, so to avoid excessive salt, we usually use half the recommended dosage. But there is another way to fertilize orchids, and this is my favorite, and in my experience, the best way to fertilize them is to use small quantities of fertilizer within a month. So let's say the fertilizer label recommends X amount. All you need to do is get that amount and split it in 4. Pretty much 4 quarters. And if you know usually fertilizers recommend that you use that dosage once a month, well, why don't you use a quarter of that dosage every time you water? Presuming you water about 4 to 5 to 6 times a month, 4 of those times can be with the fertilized solution and the other times with plain water, simply to flush out any additional salts. What you end up with, splitting that maximum amount in 4, is a weaker fertilized solution inside the pot, which has greater chances to actually be consumed by the orchid rather than deposit on the medium and in time lead to root burn. This method of watering works so well and it is so popular that it even has its own name. It's what we refer to as weekly. Notice the wordplay there. With any fertilization regime that you use, it is also a good idea to flush the pot, meaning either soaking, either running clear water without fertilizer through the pot. In this way, you can actually dissolve whatever salt deposits there might be, flush them out, and overall maintain the pot free of salt buildup and the roots of your orchid a lot safer. So at this point, you can see why pre-watering the orchid medium becomes simply useless effort. Since we're on the subject of over-fertilization, this can manifest in a secondary way as well. And this is the drying of leaf tips. Some orchids are predisposed to this, especially those orchids that don't really need high amounts of fertilizer. So a high concentration of fertilizer, even in liquid form, might not affect the root system, but might affect the leaves. And if we check the Wikipedia entry, we can actually learn how it works. So I'll put the article on the screen and also link it down in the description. And what we see on Wikipedia is that fertilizer burn is the result of desiccation of plant tissue due to osmotic stress, creating a state of hypertonicity. Well, if you read on the article, you learn what it is, but it has to do with what I told you earlier. Fertilizer salts are hygroscopic, they attract moisture. A high quantity of salts in the leaf tissue actually desiccates the tissue. So yet another reason not to use high quantities of fertilizer in one watering. If you go with the weekly regime, I guarantee things will be a heck of a lot better, and this is tested by myself personally. I did some over-fertilizing mistakes as well in the past. I learned my lesson, and with orchids it's easier to under-fertilize, and if you notice that the orchid has some little deficiencies, obviously you can correct them, add more fertilizer, and adapt your regime according to the orchid's needs. But to start with, play it safe, use less fertilizer. So these have been 5 of the golden orchid rules we can actually break. I do believe that in order to break or bend a rule, we first need to understand why it's there, how it works, what the result is, because some orchid rules cannot be broken. Or they can, but it's really not a good idea. The ones that I talked about today are being broken pretty much all the time by orchid growers, but we need to be aware of the risks, what can lead to problems, and how to avoid them. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I notice you guys really like my videos with top 10 things or 5 things that this, and that. So I'm up for ideas. If you have ideas of this sort of topics, where I make a sort of a top or a list, do leave them in a comment down below. I'm reading all of your comments. I might not respond to all of them, obviously, but I do read them, and many of your suggestions I do actually put in videos. So alrighty guys, thank you for watching, hope you've enjoyed it, and you know the drill. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a like, a share would be fabulous, and also don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you like to watch other orchid videos from me, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time, bye! By the way, have you ever wondered why YouTubers always ask for ratings and shares and subscriptions and comments and all of that? Well, it's actually pretty easy. One of the things us YouTubers have to deal with, especially when we have very small channels, is exposure. It's not enough to actually make interesting or nice or entertaining videos. People need to see that you're making these videos. Now, the YouTube algorithm favors the videos that get interaction. They get comments, likes, and all of those things, plus subscriptions, of course. You know that section YouTube has on the right side where you have recommended videos? Well, that is the only way our videos can become visible on YouTube. So pretty much all everybody is asking is for YouTube to give us the chance to say, hi, I exist too, I make videos. Care to watch some of them? I made them myself. And that's pretty much all there is to it.